Good morning. So, I'm making an update video for my Cuban DNA Ancestry. I've done videos for a bunch of them since 2016. This is an update not so much in my DNA results, although I'll go over those. I think those have been a little updated. I mean, they always update a little bit. I don't know if it's more accurate than before or what. It's always interesting to look at, though, just because some things are consistent, some things are random. So it's kind of like, maybe I'm a little of everything, but this is what I got. But this is more about some interesting stuff I found about my family history. So, let me first go over my background. I was born in Cuba in 1994. I came over to the U.S. What do you want? I came over to the U.S. in 1996, so I didn't really grow up there. I grew up in the U.S. in Miami, Florida. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and my husband is from Texas, and his family has lived in Texas for generations. He is of Mexican descent, but he's also of like the indigenous people from Texas, so he's like Texan by blood, like literally. Whereas I'm Cuban, of primarily European descent, and my results are 42% Spanish, 31% Portuguese, 6% North African, 6% English, Northwest Europe, 4% Welsh, 3% French, 2% Nigerian, 2% Basque, 1% Senegalese, 1% Ivory Coast and Ghanan, 1% Khoisan, Aka, and Mabuti people, 1% Baltic, and less than 1% Native American. Now, some of these results are not surprising. I mean, the Spanish is obvious. That's like the baseline European stock for Cuba. It was colonized by the Spanish. They received tons of immigrants from Spain. That's expected. Portuguese being pretty high is pretty expected too. What I do know about the Spanish is that my Spanish side is mostly from the Canary Islands and Galicia. And I know most of the Galician is from my mom's side, and most of the Canarian is from my mom's dad's side. And I believe my dad's side, the Spanish is Canarian as well. I actually don't know much about my dad's side. I'm not as close with that side of the family, and to be honest, that side of the family is not as Americanized, as in there's not as many of that side of the family in the U.S. compared to my mom's side. My mom's side has lived in the U.S., like the ones that I'm close to, since at least 1980. My aunt came on the Mario boat lift. I have some distant cousins that I trace on Ancestry.com and that I got in contact with. One of them was born the same year as my mom, 1975, in Queens, New York, and I got in contact with her. She's pretty cool. But as far as like the people I grew up with, my aunt and uncle and my older cousin, they came over in 1980. And those were the first that I was aware of that came to the U.S. So I am technically first generation American. Now, what we know from my mom's side of the family, from my mom's dad's side of the family, my great-grandfather was born in Cuba, and he died in the U.S. He was born in 1919, died in 2009, and he was a political prisoner in the 70s for protesting against the Castro regime. Because of my great-grandfather's sacrifice, we were able to leave in the 90s. We came on American Airlines. They had this thing. We came on July 18th, 96, which I believe was a Wednesday. There was like a day of the week, I think it was Wednesday or Thursdays, where American Airlines would fly people as political refugees out of Cuba. But we flew from Havana to Cancun, and from Cancun to Miami. Now, my grandfather until recently lived in Cuba. He came over in like the end of the last decade. But he believed that his grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, the father obviously of my great grandfather that was the one who we came with in the 90s, he believed that his grandfather was born in Spain sometime in the 19th century and came to Cuba when he was young. So, if your grandparents are Spanish born, then you can qualify for Spanish citizenship, and he wanted to do that so he can leave Cuba, because Cuba's a piece of shit place to live. It's a beautiful country, but the government's horribly oppressive. So he wanted a way out of Cuba that was, easier than waiting for a visa and all that to come to the U.S. So he was trying really hard to find out, like, the birth certificate or birth records of his grandfather to prove that he was Spanish and that he could leave. Well, much to the dismay of, the fact that he was trying to do this so he can get out of Cuba, he found out his grandfather wasn't born in Spain. He was born in Mexico, which means he could not qualify for that Spanish citizenship, and he couldn't use that to get out of Cuba, which was a bummer for him. So we believed for the greater part of the last decade that my great-great-grandpa was born in Mexico. We believe that at least his father was a Spaniard. Don't know much about his mother. And that's basically what we believe for the last few years. And I did mention that, I think, in one of the update videos. Because at the time I did the DNA results, my grandpa still believed that his grandpa was born in Spain. And that's what we thought. Well, then we thought he was born in Mexico. Well, recently, we just found out he wasn't even born in Mexico either. He was born in New Mexico, USA, in the 1880s, possibly 1882. They were able to find out he was born in Valencia County, New Mexico, just outside of Albuquerque, in the 1880s, and he likely came to Cuba in the early 1900s. He can confirm from an older relative that he was actually old enough. He left New Mexico old enough to remember life there, because when he lived in Cuba, he always went on about how much he missed life in New Mexico. So, at the end of the day, we have my grandpa trying to find out where his grandpa was born in Spain, thinking he was born in Spain, found out he was born in Mexico, then find out he was born in the U.S. So all this time, my great-great-grandfather was an American who immigrated to Cuba. And technically, well, nowadays, I believe if you're under the age of 18 and your grandparents are American-born, you can qualify for American citizenship. Now, obviously, we're talking about being born in the 1880s, okay? This is very different, but, we're talking about, nowadays. And now, obviously, technically, my great-grandpa was born in 1919. I don't know what the laws were like back then, especially for someone who was born in Cuba. But, theoretically, if you're able to retroactively apply the laws, he could have qualified for American citizenship. But I don't know, he was the eighth of nine kids. So, I don't know how close he was with his father. He was obviously, if my great-great-grandpa was born in 1882 and my great-grandpa was born in 1919, he was 37 when he had him, or 36, 37, so I don't know. He did die, they could confirm that he died in the early 60s, I believe 1960 or 1961. My great-grandpa does remember him. My grandpa does remember him. He said he remembered him as being pretty old. And of course, back then, let's say if he was born in 1882, so if he died in 1960, he would have died in his late 70s. So that's not super old by today's standards, but think about Cuba right after the revolution, and he was a farmer, so he was always out in the sun. He was probably looked a lot older than a 79-year-old does, nowadays, especially in the U.S. So, and he grew up out in the desert of the American West, so. But I find it really fascinating to discover this, because I remember when I was a kid, I was always fascinated by, the Wild West and cowboys and stuff like that. And I had this book, I still have it somewhere in there, and there was a page that was dedicated to the Wild West, and I love looking at it. I love just the style of the time, the aesthetic. So I remember, oh, I also had this little cactus to celebrate my apparent New Mexican heritage. No, but I remember asking my Mom, did we have any ancestors who lived in the Wild West, the Old West, and stuff like that? And she would say, no, we're from Cuba. Why would we have ancestors who lived in, like, what is, technically Texas, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, Colorado, like that part of the country, when we're from Cuba and we're immigrants? Turns out we actually did. We had an ancestor not that long ago. I mean, he died in just over a decade before my mom was born, who was born in New Mexico. I mean, it was the New Mexico territory, but it was, outside of Albuquerque. And Albuquerque is actually a really historic city. I believe it's like one of the oldest Spanish settlements in North America. Like, not as old as St. Augustine, but it's pretty old. It's from like the 16th century, if I'm not mistaken. And New Mexico is a cool state. I mean, I've been there once. I'm planning to go back in the winter. I'm going to visit some in-laws in El Paso, and we'll be going down through New Mexico. So on the way back, I want to kind of like explore Albuquerque because I'm a huge fan of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, and I just think New Mexico is gorgeous. Like, I wouldn't live there because I'm not a desert kind of person. I like the woods, and I like trees, and like water, and like snow. And New Mexico is too dry and hot for me. But like the architecture, the history, the blend of like Spanish, Mexican, Native American culture down there, it's really cool. So, and like people like Hispanics have lived in New Mexico for hundreds and hundreds of years. Like, not just Mexicans, but like people of like direct Spanish descent. Now, we don't know much about my great-great-grandfather's parents. We believe his father was born in Spain. He did have a Spanish last name. His mother, we don't know where she was from. She might have been from New Mexico as well. She might have been Mexican. She might have been Spanish. We don't know. She might have been... Well, look at this. I got 6% English, Northwest Europe, 4% Welsh. More than likely, if I'm from Cuba and I have that in my bloodline, and I have an ancestor who was born in the U.S., maybe her side was like Anglo-American, and then she married a Spaniard. I don't know. That's a possibility. That would explain why I have 6% English, when I don't know anyone in my family with an English... Well, I do know people in my family with English surnames because they married Anglo-Americans. But anyone like from Cuba directly who's got an English surname. But that is an interesting thing. And if you think about it, obviously we immigrated to the U.S. So technically I'm a first-generation American. As in, I'm an immigrant who was the first of my bloodline that I thought to live in the U.S. So technically, if you're the immigrant, you're first generation. People who were born there and their parents are immigrants, they think they're first generation. Technically, they're second generation. So my siblings who were born in the U.S. are technically second generation. Me and my parents are first generation. But if my great-great-grandfather was born in the U.S. as well, technically that would make me sixth generation as well. Like, through that bloodline, obviously, not through most of them. I don't think there's anyone else in my family from, like, ancestor-wise that was born in the U.S., besides possibly his mother. But if it is, at the very least, if his father was a Spaniard who immigrated to the New Mexico territory, then he would be second. His father would be first generation. He'd be second. My great-grandpa would be third. My grandpa would be fourth. My mom would be fifth. And I would be sixth. So I'm both first generation and sixth generation American, which is pretty crazy. Yeah, that's some interesting family history. Another thing, so like I mentioned, I've always been into like the West, fascinated by the deserts, the mountains, the cacti, that kind of vibe. It's not like, again, it's not somewhere I would want to live. I lived out in West Texas for a while, which was cool and all. I remember I used to live in San Angelo, Texas, and then the day I left San Angelo and we went out to Cisco, Texas, I saw a tumbleweed blow across like the plains, and I thought that was kind of cool because that was very Wild Westy. I've never lived far enough west that was the desert. That would be like El Paso, if we're going through Texas or somewhere out in New Mexico. But I lived out in the Western Plains transitions, where it transitions to the desert. And my husband was born out in West Texas. He was born in San Angelo himself, and that's a lot of where his family, like his mother was from there, his grandmother was born there, like a lot of his family's from there. But I've always had a connection to that part of the country, and the only time I've been in New Mexico, we just drove from Colorado to the Texas Panhandle, but there was something about like the scenery there that was just beautiful, and it literally brought a tear to my eye, like just seeing those distant hills and mesas, and just like, it wasn't the desert, but it was very dry. It looked like the desert. Technically, the desert in New Mexico, you had to go further south than where we were before you hit the desert, or further west. So we were like at the edge of the plains there, but it looked like the desert. So I don't know. There was something about being out there that like connected to my soul, and to find out that, oh, my great-great-grandpa was actually born and raised in that part of the country. I mean, and it was the Wild West. Like, he was born in the 1880s. That's like, when you watch cowboy movies, that's when those movies are set. Obviously Hollywood fabricated a lot of that shit. But, yeah, it's very likely that he was probably a cowboy, because that was the way of life back then. And he was a farmer in Cuba, so he probably just brought that, that vaquero culture from New Mexico to Cuba. And I don't know, it's just a cool thing to get in touch with, part of who your family was, where they came from, even if it was so long ago. I mean, 1882, that's over 100 years before I was born. But like, it's just cool to know. To me, that's more interesting than the numbers, Like, it's cool to know that I'm 2% Nigerian, which is not a huge number. But I don't know anybody. I mean, I know of relatives that I have that are like not full black, but they've got African features. Like my great-grandmother, from my mom's dad's side, had African features, and from my dad's side, there's people with African features. But I don't know anybody who is from Senegal. Or I don't even know, honestly, there are people in my family, like, descended, obviously, from Spain, but I didn't know anybody who actually lived in Spain. So to know where somebody lived, and to be able to visit that place. Because when I'm going down to El Paso, we're going to come back to New Mexico, so I could actually visit the small town that he was born in, which is Valencia, which is in the county of Valencia County. There is that small little town. It's like a 2,000 people type of town, but it is cool to like physically envision like where they were from, what they did. And I think that we should pass these stories on to future generations. Obviously there's bad things of the past too, I mean, but just share stories like that. I think that's pretty interesting. And it's like we all come full circle. I mean, I don't live in New Mexico, but I live in the U.S., and I married somebody from the southwestern part of the country. I've lived in that, not New Mexico, but I lived in West Texas. It's that kind of vibe, it is a cool part of the country. It's very scenic. Again, it's not my cup of tea to live in, but it is like, it's a cool part of the world, really. I mean, there's so much culture and history there. It's Spanish, it's Native American, it's Mexican, it's Anglo-Americans. And, being Cuban, you've got all these mixes too. You've got the Spaniards, you've got the Africans, there's even the Chinese that came down to Cuba. And it's just kind of like, I think what it was is, I did hear that he arrived to Cuba by sailing from the Yucatan Peninsula, which is where Cancun is. So let's say he sailed from Cancun to Havana. That's full circle because I flew from Havana to Cancun before ending up in Miami. And obviously, Miami didn't even exist at the time that he was born. So, I don't know. Anyway, that's this update. It's more about that part of my family history, and I just thought it was really cool, and wanted to share that. So.